Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be reviewing a variety of yarns from Holst Garn. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Knee Knits. My name is Amy and here I love to talk about all things knitting, and today's video is a yarn review video which I have not done in a while, so I'm really excited to be filming this today. So if you've heard about Holst Garn and wanted to know what their yarns are like in person, hopefully I can do that today in this video and give you some more information if you want to try them or have never heard of them and want to hear what they're all about. Holst Garn is a yarn brand based out of Denmark. They do have a physical store, but they do also have a web shop that ships all over the world, and they have a wide variety of natural fiber yarns. So I've always wanted to try Holst Garn. It was a brand that I've heard about. They are not too prevalent in US retail shops. I've seen them at a few yarn stores here and there. They had originally reached out to me, wanted to send me some yarn. They sent me this really cute box with a wide variety of their yarn types in some of my favorite colors to try. So I was able to swatch up all of the yarns that they sent me. These are all blocked swatches, so we're going to talk about each one of them today. Before diving into the review, I will share that I am wearing my Amy sweater. It's a pattern by Petite Knit. This I knit out of Holst Garn Pure Gint in the color Cocoa Nibs. If you're curious what I'm wearing, that is my sweater today. So the first yarn is Holst Garn Supersoft, which is probably like their flagship yarn, probably the yarn that they're most known for. Holst Garn Supersoft is a light fingering weight wool. It's a 50% blend of merino and a 50% blend of Shetland wool. This yarn is sold in 50-gram balls or 500-gram cones, and in a 50-gram ball you get 287 meters or 314 yards per ball. The recommended needle size for a single strand of Supersoft is 3 to 3.5 millimeter needles. Supersoft comes in such a wide variety of colors, like their shade range is crazy. So they sent me the color Cloverleaf, which is this kind of dark emerald green or forest green color, and my first impression of this is that the yarn is kind of stiff and rough to the touch. It has kind of like a wiry feel, and Holst Garn is kind of known for this. They do say on their website, and if you talk to people who know the brand, they always say Holst Garn Supersoft contains spinning oil and excess dye that gives it kind of like a rough texture before you block your knitwear. So I can definitely feel that while touching the yarn strand just straight out of the ball. It's surprisingly stiff and has kind of like a loose twist, and it does seem like this could be a little bit splitty. The yarn is also pretty delicate, probably because it is just a loosely spun 2-ply, so if you apply enough force you can rip it apart with just your hands, which I've never experienced before in a ball of yarn, but I will say while knitting with it I did not experience any breaking. So I knit my swatch with the yarn held single on 3.5 millimeter needles, and the knitting experience was not as bad as the initial touch experience of this yarn, which I'm happy about. I feel like the knitting movement of making the stitches, I didn't really feel too much stiffness or resistance from the yarn. It felt certainly not super smooth, but it definitely wasn't painful. It wasn't stiff. It was just kind of like I would say a neutral knitting experience. Nothing spectacular, but nothing negative either. While looking at my knitting while knitting it, it was definitely a little off in tension. The stitches were not plump. So I definitely saw a transformation once I blocked this swatch. The yarn definitely plumped up, and it definitely has less of an oily and textured feel, although I wouldn't say that this turns into a yarn that is super soft. So the name is a little bit misleading, and I do think it depends on your experience with different wools, what you might think of this yarn. So if you're someone who has exclusively used merino wools, maybe superwash merino wools, those yarns are not going to feel anything like this. This definitely has a lot more texture, it has a lot more grip, and overall just has kind of like a brushed texture as opposed to something that is very smooth and supple. That being said, the Supersoft is not scratchy at all. Like, I think it still can have kind of this rustic texture, but it's not pokey, it's not itchy to me. I have a pretty high tolerance for wool, so keep that in mind as I'm talking about these fabrics. But I would definitely wear this next to skin. It feels like it would be very comfortable, and I do kind of love the melange texture that you can get specifically. This color is called Cloverleaf, and I know some of the colors have a little bit more of a melange effect than the other ones, but I think it adds a nice amount of dimension to the finished fabric. My finished gauge on this swatch on the 3.5 millimeter needles is 24 stitches per 4 inches, so definitely a fingering weight fabric probably will be good for fingering weight color work, given that this yarn has a bit of texture and grip. Now, considering that I don't knit a lot of fingering weight garments for myself, I did want to swatch this held double, which is what I did next and what I have here. So this is Holst Garn Supersoft held double on 4.5mm needles. But as someone who mostly knits DK weight garments, I think this gives me a better picture of what this would look like knit up for a full garment or a full project that I would make. And again, you still get that very melange kind of heathered look with this color specifically. It does have a soft feel, but isn't the most smooth because of the texture and kind of the loose spin of the yarn. I think this is mostly just due to the fact that this is a very loosely spun wool. Things from Holst Garn and Knitting for Olive, those are tighter worsted spun yarns, and this is just not very comparable because of the loose twist and two-ply nature of the yarn. So for Holst Garn Supersoft, if you're someone who is familiar with Shetland wool and maybe thought it was a little bit too rustic, I think this is a good alternative because it does have the 50% blend of Shetland and 50% merino. That merino content really brings the Shetland into a more soft, next to skin, wearable fabric. But if you're someone who is used to 100% merino, this might be a little bit surprising to you and maybe out of your comfort zone due to the 50% Shetland content. It was really cool to see the blocking transformation with this yarn, and sold in 50-gram balls that are less than $4 per ball. I think this is a pretty good value for a 100% wool yarn. Definitely something to take a look at if you're looking for a yarn line that has a really wide variety of colors. Next up is Holst Garn Coast, which I have here in the color Cobalt. Holst Garn Coast is a light fingering weight yarn. It's a 55% lamb's wool and 45% cotton blend. This is a 50-gram ball that has 350 meters or 383 yards per ball. So given that yardage, this is a very light fingering weight. I would definitely not compare this to fingering weight yarns that have close to 250 meters. Like this has 350 meters, so definitely thin, and the recommended needle size is 2.5mm to 3mm for this held single. So first impressions of this yarn, it has the same construction as Supersoft, a very loose two-ply yarn that can break if you pull too hard on it. Again, didn't have any issues while actually knitting with it, but something to keep in mind. It does feel cottony, like first impressions of touching it, it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely a cotton yarn. It's very smooth and has a very light touch. So I knit my swatch on 3mm needles, and my first thoughts while knitting this is, wow, this is a really thin yarn. I feel like on 3mm needles, my stitches still looked pretty spread apart and my finished fabric was pretty see-through, and maybe I had some tensioning issues due to it being a looser gauge for the yarn. The actual knitting experience was pretty smooth. I liked the feeling of this yarn in my hands and on the needles. Compared to the Supersoft unblock swatch, this had more even tension than Supersoft, and I was expecting even more blooming with washing. This has the same sort of spinning oil and dye that is remaining in the ball before you block it that will wash out when you do your initial block. Now, after blocking this swatch, I definitely found that this yarn softened up even more than it already was, which is pretty significant because this yarn to start with is already like very soft. It definitely created a really enticing fabric that I would really enjoy having in a finished garment. This definitely would be next to skin soft for anybody. I feel like feeling the finished fabric, I would be surprised to guess that there is wool in here. It really just feels like a nice kind of brush cotton fabric. So I think this yarn is a pretty good balance of having both the wool and the cotton content. The wool made it a pretty pleasurable knitting experience and blocking experience, and the cotton makes the finished fabric really comfortable. This yarn also comes in a really wide variety of shades. You can see all of the color cards here, a good variety of neutrals and pops of color as well. Since this is a cotton blend, my instinct would be to use this for spring and summer projects, things that you would want to wear in warmer weather. However, because it's so thin, I would be hesitant to use this held single in a garment. My gauge here on the 3mm needles ended up being about 28 stitches per 4 inches, which is a common gauge for fingering weight patterns. If you look it up, things like the tanks from My Favorite Things Knitwear or some tees from Petite Knit are knit at this gauge. But even at the 28 stitch gauge, this this seems pretty see-through for my liking, so I would want to size my needle down and then get a denser gauge, which might be a little bit tedious to knit a whole garment out of. I would be intrigued to try the Holst Garn Coast held double for a spring or summer knit, maybe at a sport weight gauge. I think holding this double at a DK weight gauge, you'd probably get the same issue with having it be pretty see-through, so I would stick with maybe sport weight. Again, try a gauge swatch and see what you get. I didn't personally get a chance to hold this double yet, but of course I still have this whole ball, so maybe I will and see how that goes. But if you're interested in a wool cotton blend, I think Coast feels very nice. Just be wary of the thinness of the yarn and the gauge of your project. The next yarn is Tides, which is a light fingering weight yarn that is 70% merino and 30% silk. This is in the color cream, and they're 287 meters or 314 yards per 50 gram ball. The recommended needle size for this yarn is 3 to 3.5 millimeters held single. Tides is a pretty tweedy yarn because it is 70% merino. That's mostly the base, and then the silk creates the sort of tweed lighter color neps that you can see on the other colors here. So I was kind of surprised to learn that right after I'd finished knitting up my swatch, because in the cream you can't really tell that it's tweedy. So my first impression of this yarn is that I was surprised it contained silk. I feel like touching it, it doesn't really feel like the quintessential silky feel that you might be used to. When I say silk, I think of things that are shiny and drapey and very smooth and kind of slippery. This doesn't really have any of that. Very similar to the other yarns, this is a loose 2-ply yarn. So I knit my swatch on 3.5 millimeter needles, and I really enjoyed the knitting experience. I think it is because this is 70% merino, something that is plump and has a bit of springiness to it. The knitting experience was really great. I also really liked how the knitting stitches came out on my swatch before blocking. I felt like they looked very plump compared to the other Holst Garn yarns that I had been swatching. This definitely filled out the most before blocking. I enjoyed working with this yarn, and of course after blocking I did see a little bit of blooming and growth in the stitches as well. My gauge after blocking ended up being about 25 stitches per 4 inches here, and in terms of softness and drape, I do really like how soft this feels. It definitely has a next to skin feeling. It has kind of like that dry wool feeling, but if I were to compare this to Coast with the cotton, the Coast definitely feels softer and more enticing compared to the Tides. I think if you're into merino wools, you'll be into Tides. I do really like the finished fabric of it. It definitely feels like something I would be excited to wear. This is fingering weight yarn, so again, similar to the other yarns, I'd be curious to see what it is like knit up double at maybe a DK weight gauge, which is more up my alley for garments. But if you're into fingering weight garments, I think this is a good option for something that gets really plump, fills out the stitches well, and feels really smooth and soft. Now, when I hear about silk yarns, my mind automatically goes to spring and summer knits because that's when I mostly use silk yarns. But because this is only 30% silk, I would definitely approach this yarn with more of a woolly wool mindset, more of a fall and winter knit mindset, less of a summer mindset. I don't really think I would wear this in the heat of summer because it does feel pretty warm. It doesn't really have that kind of airiness and drape that you might get from a yarn that has a much higher silk content. I could see myself holding this double for a sweater if I'm looking for something that has that tweedy look. Again, just looking at the color selection, these all have kind of that tweed effect, but if you're not looking for the tweed effect, I would probably still go for the Supersoft in comparison, just because it has such a wider range of colors to select from. The Tide sells on the Holst Garn website for about $3.50 per ball. Next up is Haya, which is a fingering weight blend of 70% baby alpaca, 20% mulberry silk, and 10% yak. I have here the color Moules, which is a dark graphite gray. Now this, out of all the yarns that I've tried from Holst Garn, is probably the most true fingering weight. I feel like everything else has kind of been a light fingering weight. This one is 200 yards or 183 meters per 50 gram ball. The suggested needle size is a 3 or a 3.5 3.5mm needle. So first impressions of this yarn is that it's very soft, it's very smooth, it's very luxurious feeling. It has that drape that you definitely get from an alpaca yarn. You can see the sheen from the silk and the yak. This is definitely a tighter spun 3-ply yarn compared to the other yarns, so this is probably more similar to yarns that I'm used to, having a very round shape. So I knit my swatch using 3.5mm needles, and I really enjoyed the knitting experience. It was super soft and super smooth. I feel like they should have named this yarn Supersoft instead of the other one, because this is definitely by far the softest yarn out of the bunch. The stitches were very full and plump before blocking. I had no issues with tensioning. This yarn just felt very nice on the needles. But keep in mind, this is a very slippery yarn, so I was knitting with metal needles. If I was knitting a full project with this, I probably would opt for wooden needles or bamboo needles with a little bit more grip, because this yarn tends to fly out of your fingers and off the needles pretty easily. While this is a generally smooth yarn, you can tell in the finished swatch that there are a lot of loose alpaca fibers that stick out from it. If you've knit with alpaca before, this is pretty status quo. This yarn creates an incredibly drapey and smooth swatch. You can see it here. I can only imagine this at a full scale like shawl or scarf, just being super loose and flexible and drapey. My blocked gauge ended up being about 25 stitches per 4 inches, and you can see the fabric is pretty dense, not too see-through at the 3.5mm gauge. This does seem like it would be great for shawls and loose accessories. I would definitely not go for this for a garment just because it is 70% baby alpaca. This is going to have pretty minimal structural integrity, so if you do knit a garment out of this, just be aware of stretching over time and just overall losing its shape, especially if you're doing a garment that is seamless. I think this would be a great yarn for delicate accessories like neck scarves. I think this would make a really nice gift. I've seen a lot of projects on Ravelry use this for the Sophie scarf by Petite Knit. I think this would make a really luxurious feeling gift that someone who has never had an alpaca accessory before would really enjoy. Now, I can be a little bit sensitive to some alpaca yarns. Generally, if it's labeled baby alpaca, which Haya is baby alpaca, I don't have too many issues. And holding this next to skin, of course, this is just such like a brief moment in time test, but I don't feel any immediate prickliness or irritation, so I would be excited to wear this next to skin in a little neck scarf or cowl. Compared to the other Holst Garn yarns, Haya has a smaller shade range. You can see they are mostly muted tones and some neutrals. It's sold in 50-gram balls at $8.75 per ball. This is Cielo, which is an Aran weight blend of 42% baby alpaca, 42% merino, and 16% polyamide. This is a Aran weight yarn that is 125 meters or 136 yards per 50-gram ball, and the suggested needle size for this is 6mm. First impressions of this yarn is the squish. It is so plump, it feels very airy and very light. You get a lot of volume here because of the chainette construction. Now, this yarn is constructed out of a knit I-cord, which depending on what yarns you've used before might be a little bit different than other chainette yarns. This is not the same as a blown chainette yarn that features a nylon tube where the loose fibers are blown into the tube. This is instead a knit I-cord of all of the fibers, which creates a little bit more contained of a yarn. So you can see there's not a lot of loose fibers sticking out from the strand here. The I-cord construction does give the yarn itself a little bit of an irregular texture, which you can see on the ball here. And it's a very stretchy yarn that, depending on how tight you pull it, can get thinner or thicker. The yarn itself is as soft and as fluffy as it looks. It's just so cozy. Overall, it has kind of a fluffy look rather than a hairy look. And while knitting with it, I didn't really experience any shedding, which is kind of a benefit of the I-cord construction. So I swatched this yarn on 6mm needles, and the main thing I noticed while knitting was the stretchiness of the yarn. You do have to be pretty cognizant of how tight you're pulling the yarn. You don't want to pull it so tightly that the yarn loses its original diameter. The stitches it creates are very full and plump, and despite the texture of the yarn itself, it creates a very smooth looking finished fabric. I did encounter some snagging of this yarn on the needle while knitting with it, like sometimes my needle would just go straight through the strand and get caught gotten it rather than actually knitting the stitch, which was a little frustrating, but it happened so infrequently that it didn't really deter me from wanting to use the yarn. My finished swatch is pretty dense, like you can't see through it at all. I ended up getting a gauge of 20 stitches per 4 inches, and looking at the swatch, I probably would opt to size up a needle and go for 6.5 millimeters next time I use this yarn, but I really like how it looks in the stockinette. It just looks very like smooth, and like I said before, the yarn's not really hairy, and I feel like the finished fabric is not really hairy either. It's just kind of like a fluffy look. It is super squishy, and at an Aran weight it is really thick, so I can imagine this would just make really cozy, warm, bulky knits. Now, I did actually end up using this yarn for a project. I got the color Granny to knit the Sophie shawl, which I have here, because I knew that this yarn would be pretty well suited for an accessory that I wanted to be really soft and cozy. So I did knit my Sophie shawl on 5.5 millimeter needles, and I love it. It's about 2 months old. Now, this yarn is delicate, as with any kind of chainette style yarn, so do expect this yarn to have a bit of pilling. If you are to knit a garment out of it, it's probably going to look pretty ragged pretty quickly, especially around areas under the sleeve and the underarm. You can see here on my Sophie shawl, which doesn't get a whole lot of friction, that there is a bit of a halo and sort of some pills forming across the edge of the scarf. For me, it's just kind of part of using a fluffy yarn like this, but if you're someone who despises pilling, you might not want to opt for Cielo for your next project. So this is the current shade range of Cielo. You can see a lot of primary colors and some neutrals. I do think that this is a really fun option for just like a satisfying, quick, bulky knit. The last 2 yarns I'll be reviewing are lace weight yarns from Holst Garn, and the first up is Titicaca. This is a lace weight 100% alpaca yarn. I have here the color Passion, which is a really bright blue. This yarn is a 50-gram ball that contains 400 meters or 437 yards. The suggested needle size for this held single is 2.5 to 3 millimeter needles, and if you hold it double, the suggested needle size is 3.5 to 4 millimeter needles. My first impressions of this yarn is that it's very similar to other 100% lace weight alpaca yarns on the market. It's very smooth and soft. This is a 2-ply yarn that is, I would say, kind of tightly twisted, at least compared to the other Holst Garn yarns. If you look closely, you can see all of the alpaca fibers sticking out from the ball. That gives it a little bit more texture than it might first appear from far away. Now, I was not going to swatch this held single at a lace weight gauge, so I did hold it double and swatch it on 4 millimeter needles. It was a fine knitting experience, nothing too great, but nothing too bad either. I feel like alpaca can be very slippery, and I was using metal needles, so it was a little tricky to keep an even tension. I was kind of surprised at my finished swatch before blocking, given that the yarn in the ball looks pretty smooth, but my swatch looked pretty uneven and not smooth. It had a lot more texture than I expected. You can really see the alpaca fibers sticking out from the fabric. Now, after blocking, the swatch did even out a bit, and I would say the tension kind of evened itself out in a good way, which I am excited about because that initial swatch did not look that good. The fabric itself is very light and smooth. Again, the most prominent thing that I can see here are the alpaca fibers sticking out from it. My gauge here is 24 stitches per 4 inches, and compared to Haya, which was the yarn earlier that was a blend of alpaca and silk and yak, this has a more rustic look, a more textured and uneven look, where the Haya has more of a uniform and luxurious look. I also feel like the Haya has a little bit more substance to the fabric, like it's a little bit denser. It seems like it would hold itself pretty well, but the Titicaca held double just seems really loose and unstable, and these do have very similar gauges. We have 24 stitches here and 25 stitches here per 4 inches. If I was looking for something that was alpaca for drapiness and smoothness, I would probably go for the Haya rather than the Titicaca held double. I also personally don't really know a lot of projects or patterns that recommend 100% baby alpaca at like a fingering weight gauge. I've knit the Penny Gloves by Petite Knit out of that yarn combo, but I really haven't seen it recommended anywhere else. So I did go for a swatch of one strand of the Titicaca, which I also have here in the color Lush Green, with one strand of the Holst Garn Supersoft. So this is one of Holst Garn's recommended yarn combos, and on 4mm needles, I really like this combo. I do have the color match here. So Holst Garn kind of does this thing where they have lists of their yarn colors that will match. So although this is called Clover and this is called Lush Green, they are considered a Holst Garn perfect match, which basically creates a uniform color in your finished fabric. That doesn't mean your swatch or fabric might not have a melange effect, but it won't really have a marling effect. And I would say that's true here. You can't really tell where the strands are different. It's a pretty clean, uniform look. And I really like the fullness of this fabric. It does feel very soft to the touch because of the alpaca, but still has that kind of substance and structure from the Supersoft. Now, comparing the Supersoft and Titicaca to the Supersoft Health Double, the Titicaca swatch is definitely a more pleasant feel, while the Supersoft Double kind of contains that rustic woolly feel. So depending on what you're looking for in the finished feel of your garment, if you're looking for something that has a bit more plushness and kind of like a softness to the hand feel, I think the Titicaca held as a second strand really does that to the Supersoft. I did get a 22 stitch per 4-inch gauge here, which would work for a lot of DK weight garments. So although I don't see a whole lot of uses and practicality to the Titicaca on its own, I do think it did work well as a second strand to the Supersoft. At $7 for a 50-gram ball, it does seem like a good alternative to lace weight silk mohairs, and definitely check out the perfect match thing on the Holst Garn website. It does seem like a really helpful resource if you're shopping for yarn colors and want to make sure you have a uniform finished fabric. The last yarn I'll be talking about is Lucia, which is a lace weight 42% baby alpaca, 35 mulberry silk, and 13% merino wool, and 10% yak yarn. Almost forgot about the yak there. And Holst Garn advertises this as an alternative to silk mohair. There is no mohair in this yarn, and it's 200 meters or 219 yards per 25-gram ball. Now, my first impressions of this yarn is that it definitely has the same vibe as silk mohair. Looking at the yarn strand, you can see that core and then the little fibers coming off of it. The core is a little bit shiny, and the fibers itself are pretty short and maybe pretty curly. I feel like the strand of yarn, the loose fibers sit very close to the strand. They're shorter and not as long and hairy as what I've seen in a lot of silk mohairs. This yarn is very soft. It definitely has a fluffy feel, definitely has a very cloud-like feel. The overall look of this yarn is definitely more matte than silk mohairs. I feel like silk mohairs have a very shiny appearance. This, although the core of the yarn has a little bit of shine, the overall, like from far away, it has kind of a matte look. It does look like the cores on the Lucia tend to stay pretty light, so if you are shopping for a dark color, keep that in mind with the lightness of the core shining through. It does seem to be more prevalent on some colors rather than others, like these yellows and oranges kind of show it, but the black doesn't show it at all. So that's interesting. So for my swatch of Lucia, I held this with one strand of Holst Garn Supersoft on 4mm needles. I really enjoyed knitting the swatch. I do knit a lot of garments with fingering weight wools held with lace weight silk mohairs, so this experience was pretty similar. However, I did experience less shedding from this, and because the yarn fibers are very short and close to the strand, I think there is a lot less likelihood of shedding with this here. My finished swatch has a gauge of about 20 stitches per 4 inches, which is a great DK weight gauge. Now, I really like how the Lucia adds a fluffy look to the yarn. I do feel like the Lucia kind of takes over the swatch and kind of becomes the prominent fiber and fabric characteristic of the yarn, so you can see the fluff, the kind of matteness, and I feel like the Supersoft is kind of just sitting in the background while the Lucia kind of does its thing, giving most of the properties to the fabric. It is a subtle fluff rather than a prominent hairiness that you might get with a silk mohair. The Lucia definitely blurs out the stitches, so I would not opt for using this for patterns that have a lot of stitch detail. I think this might look good with kind of bold cable cables, but definitely avoid small cables or lace with this. I think you might lose a lot of the stitch definition. Now, I'm someone who uses a lot of silk mohair because I do really enjoy the shininess that it gives to the finished piece. So since this doesn't have the kind of shine that I get from silk mohair, I might be hesitant to use this myself, but that's just my personal preference. I would say I'd be going out of my comfort zone using this yarn combo, but in terms of feeling the fabric, I can definitely see myself wearing this as a sweater held next to skin. I think this would be a good choice if you're someone who's been looking for an alternative to a mohair. Maybe you are allergic, or maybe you just haven't enjoyed silk mohairs. This might be a good option to try, as it is less prominent and more of a subtle fluff. You can get a 25-gram ball of Lucia for $7.58. So overall, I'm impressed with the Holst Garn yarns, especially given their low price points compared to other brands. Although some of the yarns, like Supersoft, have a seemingly stiff texture out of the ball, I think they knit up quite well, and the finished fabric would appeal to someone who's a fan of woolier, dry wools. I think it's important to note the loose twist of the yarns and the relative thinness that they have compared to other yarns labeled as fingering weight. Most of these definitely lean towards light fingering weight, so keep that in mind and check the yardages of the balls when selecting your next project. If I were to pick a favorite swatch from this bunch, the Supersoft plus Titicaca alpaca strand really impressed me with its plush texture, and I would love to use it for a DK weight sweater one day. So these are all of the yarns I had to review from Holst Garn. If you made it to the end of the video, I have a special surprise for you. Holst Garn was really kind to offer a coupon code for this month only, for April of 2025. So if you want to shop any of the Holst Garn yarns on their website, you can use the code AMY10 to get 10% off your purchase. I hope this video was helpful for you to understand what these Holst Garn yarns are like in real life. I hope you enjoyed all of the swatches and the color cards. If this is a video that you would love to see more of, maybe some other brands or other types of yarns, let me know in the comments and I would love to make more. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you saw and want to stick around for my other knitting videos, feel free to subscribe, as I post knitting videos about once a week here on the channel. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.